My 6-year-old told me Grandma, who has dementia, plays a game where she stands outside until Daddy lets her back in. He said she's really good at waiting. I was giving my son Oliver his bath when he said something that made my hands freeze on the shampoo bottle. Mommy, Grandma played the waiting game again today. She's getting really good at it. What waiting game, baby? The one where Daddy puts her outside and she waits by the door. She stood there for a long time today. I almost let her in, but Daddy said it was against the rules. I kept my voice steady while rinsing his hair. Tell me about this game. When does Daddy play it with Grandma? Every day when you go to work. After you leave, Daddy takes Grandma to the front door and she goes outside. Then she stands there. Sometimes she knocks, but Daddy says that means she loses. Oliver was 6. My mother had been living with us for 8 months since her Alzheimer's diagnosis made it unsafe for her to live alone. My husband Keith worked from home and watched them both while I worked at the hospital. Oliver, how long does Grandma stay outside? Until lunch, usually. Sometimes longer if she keeps trying to come in. Daddy says she needs to learn patience. Does Grandma like this game? Oliver shook his head. She cries sometimes. And she asks for you. But Daddy says she's just being difficult. Yesterday she fell asleep standing up. That's when Daddy let her back in because the neighbors were looking. My stomach turned to ice. I helped Oliver into his pajamas. Does Grandma ever say anything when she's outside? She says she's cold, or she needs the bathroom. But Daddy says she's lying to win the game. One time she had an accident and Daddy got really mad. He made her stay out even longer. Sweetheart, where's Daddy when Grandma is outside? In his office playing his computer game. The one with the shooting. He wears his headphones so Grandma's knocking doesn't disturb him. I tucked Oliver in and went downstairs. Keith was on the couch watching sports highlights. My mother was in the living room chair, staring at nothing. Her hair was tangled. Her clothes were the same ones she'd worn yesterday. Mom, I said softly. She looked at me but didn't respond. The confusion in her eyes was deeper than it had been this morning. I sat next to Keith. How was Mom today? Fine. Same as always. Confused but manageable. Oliver says you've been putting her outside. Keith didn't look away from the TV. Kid's got an imagination. You know how he is. He told me specific details. About a waiting game. About her standing outside for hours. Keith's jaw tightened. She's difficult, Lisa. You don't see it because you're at work. She constantly tries to leave, opening doors, trying to get out. So I let her stand outside for a few minutes to show her it's not fun out there. She comes back in quick enough. Oliver says it's hours. Oliver doesn't understand time. 5 minutes feels like hours to a kid. He says she's cried, asked for the bathroom, had accidents. Now Keith turned to look at me. Your mother is manipulative, even with Alzheimer's. She knows if she makes a fuss, you'll baby her. I'm teaching her boundaries. She has dementia, Keith. She doesn't understand boundaries. She doesn't understand anything. Exactly. So what does it matter if she stands outside for a bit? Gets some fresh air. Better than her wandering the neighborhood. Oliver came down the stairs. Daddy, can I show Mommy the chart? What chart, baby? The one Daddy made for Grandma's game. In the kitchen, on the fridge. Keith stood up quickly, but Oliver was already pulling me to the kitchen. On the refrigerator was a piece of paper with dates and times. Mom outside the chart, it said at the top. Rows of dates going back 3 weeks. Times written next to each date. 9:15 to 11:30. 9 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. 8:45 to 1 o'clock. The times were getting longer. Oliver pointed proudly. Daddy lets me write the times down. I'm practicing my numbers. See? Today was 9 to 12:45. That's almost 4 hours. I turned to Keith, who had followed us. 4 hours. In 30-degree weather. She had a coat, Keith said. Oliver piped up. No, she didn't, Daddy. Remember? You said she didn't deserve it after she tried to open the door yesterday. Keith's face went red. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and opened the camera app. The chart stayed pinned to the refrigerator, all those dates and times written in Keith's handwriting and Oliver's careful numbers. I started taking photos. Keith moved toward me fast. Oliver, go upstairs right now. My son's face crumpled. But Daddy, I was just showing Mommy. I said upstairs. Keith's voice went hard and sharp. Oliver started crying. He looked between us, confused about why showing me the chart made Daddy so angry. I kept taking photos. The chart, the dates, the times that got longer each week. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, but I got every detail. Keith reached for my phone and I stepped back fast. Don't touch me. I held the phone against my chest. If you touch me, I'm calling the police right now. Keith stopped. His face changed. The anger smoothed out and suddenly he looked concerned and reasonable, like he was the calm one and I was overreacting. Lisa, let's talk about this privately. We don't need to upset Oliver more than he already is. Oliver was still standing there crying. I knelt down next to him. Baby, go to your room for a little bit, okay? You didn't do anything wrong, I promise. You're not in trouble. Oliver nodded and ran upstairs. I heard his bedroom door close. Keith started to say something, but I held up my hand. Sit down. On the couch. Now. I walked to where my mother sat in the living room chair. She was staring at the wall. Her hair was matted on one side like she'd been sleeping on it for days. The same blue sweater she'd worn yesterday. The same pants. I pulled out my phone again and started taking photos. Mom, can you look at me? She turned her head slowly. The confusion in her eyes made my throat tight. I took photos of her face, her tangled hair, her dirty clothes. Keith stood up from the couch. Lisa, this is ridiculous. Sit down. I didn't look at him. I moved around my mother, taking photos from different angles. When I stepped closer, she flinched. Just a small movement, pulling back when I got near. I froze. Mom, it's me. It's Lisa. She didn't seem to recognize that anything unusual was happening. She just sat there, staring past me now, back at the wall. That somehow made it worse. I took more photos. Keith sat back down hard. His jaw was tight. I could feel him watching me, but I didn't stop. Your mother is difficult, he said. His voice had that explaining tone, like he was being patient with me. You don't see it because you're at work all day. She's constantly trying to leave, opening doors, wandering around. I had to do something. She needs boundaries. I turned to look at him. She has dementia. She doesn't understand boundaries. That's exactly my point. She doesn't understand anything. So what does it matter if she stands outside for a bit? It's fresh air. Better than her wandering the neighborhood where she could get hurt or lost. I walked over to my mother and gently took her arm. The sleeve of her sweater slid up. Dark purple bruises circled her wrist. Finger marks. 4 on one side, 1 on the other, like someone had grabbed her hard. More bruises on her other arm in the same pattern. I pulled out my phone and photographed them. Keith stood up again. She bruises easily. It's the medication, and she falls constantly. You know how she is. I worked at the hospital. I knew what defensive bruising looked like. These weren't from falls. These were from someone gripping her arms hard enough to leave marks. I looked at Keith and something cold settled in my stomach. I'm calling someone. Keith moved toward me. We don't need anyone else involved. This is between us. I walked past him to the kitchen counter where my purse sat. I dug out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Keith followed me. Lisa, think about what you're doing. You're going to make this into something it's not. I found Moira's name and pressed call. She answered on the second ring. Hey, what's up? Can you come over right now? I kept my voice steady. Keith was standing 3 feet away watching me. My mother sat in the living room chair, staring at nothing. Is everything okay? No, I need you to come over. Don't ask questions. Just come. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up. Keith's face had gone red again. You're overreacting, making a huge deal out of nothing. I held my phone in my hand where he couldn't reach it. I didn't say anything. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Keith paced around the living room. I sat in a chair across from my mother, watching her. She didn't move much. Sometimes her hands would flutter in her lap like she was looking for something. Once she looked at me and opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. When the doorbell rang, Keith started to say something, but I was already at the door. Moira stood on the porch. She took one look at my face and came inside. I led her to the kitchen and showed her the chart. Her hand went to her mouth. Oh my God. I showed her the photos on my phone, my mother's condition, the bruises, the dates and times tracking how long she'd been left outside. Moira's face went pale. Lisa, this is abuse. I know. She looked at Keith, who was standing in the doorway. Her expression hardened. I'm taking Oliver to my house for the night. You need to handle this without him here. She went upstairs before Keith could argue. I heard her talking softly to Oliver, then footsteps. Then they came back down. Oliver had his backpack and his stuffed elephant. He looked scared. Moira took his hand. We're going to have a sleepover at my house, buddy. Is that okay? Oliver nodded. He looked at me. Mommy, are you mad at me? Never. I knelt down and hugged him. You were so brave telling me the truth. I love you. After they left, the house felt too quiet. Keith sat on the couch with his head in his hands. I pulled up the number for Adult Protective Services on my phone. A woman answered. Adult Protective Services, this is Heather. How can I help you? I need to report elder abuse. My voice sounded strange and flat. Heather's voice went gentle and professional. Okay. I'm going to take some information from you. Can you tell me what's happening? I told her everything. About my mother's Alzheimer's. About the chart. About finding out Keith had been locking her outside for hours in the cold. About the bruises. About Oliver's innocent description of the waiting game. Heather asked questions and took notes. I could hear her typing. She asked about my mother's condition. About the evidence I had. About whether my mother was in immediate danger. I'm opening an emergency case. Someone will come out first thing tomorrow morning to investigate. In the meantime, can you ensure your mother's safety tonight? Yes. I'll keep her with me. Do not leave her alone with your husband. I won't. After I hung up, Keith looked up. His mother had dementia too. Sometimes you have to be firm with them. They manipulate. They push boundaries. If you're not consistent, they walk all over you. I stared at him. There's a difference between firm and cruel. She's confused and scared. She doesn't understand what's happening to her. Locking her outside in freezing weather isn't discipline. It's abuse. That's not what I was doing. Then what were you doing? Teaching her. That going outside isn't fun. That she needs to stay inside where it's safe. By making her stand outside for 4 hours without a coat? Keith's jaw worked. She's difficult. You have no idea what it's like dealing with her all day while you're at work. I stood up. I'm moving her into the guest room tonight. You stay away from her. I went to my mother and helped her stand. She came with me easily, not resisting. In the guest room, I sat her on the bed and went to get clean clothes from her room. When I came back, she was still sitting exactly where I'd left her. I helped her to the bathroom and turned on the shower. Let's get you cleaned up, Mom. She looked at the running water like she wasn't sure what it was for. I helped her undress. Her skin was pale and thin, more bruises on her shoulders, on her hip. I guided her into the shower and she stood under the water without moving. I washed her hair gently, working out the tangles, soaped her back and arms. She didn't say anything, but she reached out once and patted my hand. After, I dried her off and helped her into clean pajamas. Her hair was clean for the first time in days. She smelled like soap instead of sweat and urine. I led her back to the guest room and tucked her into bed. She lay down and closed her eyes immediately. I sat in the chair next to the bed. My mother's breathing evened out. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in the clean sheets. I thought about all the mornings I'd left for work, all the days I'd trusted Keith to take care of her, all the times I'd come home and she'd seemed more withdrawn, more anxious, and I'd thought it was just the disease progressing. The guilt pressed down on my chest until I couldn't breathe right. I'd left her alone with him, every single day, while he locked her outside in the cold, while he grabbed her hard enough to bruise, while Oliver watched and learned to call it a game. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos again. The chart with its careful documentation of abuse. My mother's matted hair and dirty clothes, the bruises on her arms. Tomorrow someone from APS would come. Tomorrow I'd have to explain everything again. Tomorrow I'd have to figure out what came next. But tonight, my mother was clean and safe and sleeping. Tonight I sat in the dark guest room and watched her breathe and cried as quietly as I could. I didn't sleep. My body was tired, but my brain wouldn't shut off. I sat in the chair next to the guest bed and watched my mother breathe. Her chest moved up and down, slow and steady. She looked peaceful now. Clean pajamas, brushed hair, tucked under the blankets like a child. But I kept seeing her standing outside in the cold, for 4 hours, without a coat. While Keith sat in his office with his headphones on playing video games. My mother, who raised me alone after my dad died, who worked 2 jobs to put me through nursing school, who used to make me hot chocolate with extra marshmallows when I was sad. Now she couldn't remember my name half the time, couldn't remember where she was or what year it was. And I'd left her alone with a man who locked her outside like a dog being punished. The guilt sat on my chest like a weight. I'd trusted Keith completely. Never questioned why my mother seemed more anxious lately, more withdrawn. I'd thought it was just the Alzheimer's getting worse. But it wasn't the disease. It was him, hurting her, scaring her, making her stand outside in freezing weather until she had accidents. And Oliver had been watching, learning that this was normal, that this was how you treated confused old people. I wanted to throw up. Around 3 in the morning, my mother woke up. She looked around the room confused. Then she saw me and reached out her hand. I took it. Her skin was paper thin and cold. She didn't say anything, just held my hand and closed her eyes again. I stayed awake until the sun came up. At 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee and staring at my phone. Keith was still asleep upstairs. My mother was in the guest room. I opened the front door and found a woman in her 40s with a professional smile and a clipboard. Behind her stood a police officer. The woman held out her hand. "I'm Heather Robinson from Adult Protective Services. This is Officer Walsh. We're here about the report filed last night." I let them in. Heather had kind eyes, but her expression was all business. She asked if we could talk privately first. I took her to the kitchen while Officer Walsh stayed in the living room. Heather sat across from me and pulled out a form. She asked me to tell her everything. I went through it all again. The waiting game, the chart on the fridge, finding my mother dirty and unchanged, the bruises on her arms, Oliver's innocent descriptions of Grandma crying and having accidents. Heather took notes and asked questions. How long had my mother lived with us? What was her diagnosis? What was Keith's relationship with her before she moved in? Had I noticed any other signs of abuse or neglect? I answered everything. My voice stayed steady, but my hands shook. When I finished, Heather asked if she could examine my mother. We went to the guest room together. My mother was awake but confused. She looked at Heather with blank eyes. Heather introduced herself slowly and clearly. She asked my mother questions but got no coherent answers. Then she asked if she could check my mother's arms and legs. I helped my mother sit up. Heather documented everything. The bruises on both arms, the ones on her shoulders. She took photos with her phone. She checked my mother's hair and skin, noted that she was clean now, but asked about her condition when I'd found her last night. I described the matted hair, the unchanged clothes, the smell. Heather wrote it all down. Keith came downstairs while we were still in the guest room. I heard his voice in the living room talking to Officer Walsh. When Heather and I came out, Keith was sitting on the couch looking concerned and cooperative. He stood up when he saw us. "Officer, I'm so glad you're here. I think there's been a misunderstanding. My wife is upset and not thinking clearly." Heather's face stayed neutral. "Mr. Sullivan, I'd like to ask you some questions about your mother-in-law's care." Keith nodded eagerly. "Of course. Anything to clear this up. Lisa's mother has Alzheimer's and she's very difficult to manage. I do my best, but sometimes she gets confused and wanders. I have to keep her safe." Heather asked about the chart on the refrigerator. Keith's smile faltered. "That's just a tracking system, to monitor her behavior. When she tries to go outside, I let her stand on the porch for a few minutes so she understands it's not safe to wander. It's a teaching method." Heather asked how long a few minutes was. Keith shrugged. 5, 10 minutes maybe. Oliver doesn't understand time. He exaggerates. Officer Walsh spoke up. "We have photos of the chart. It shows times ranging from 2 to 4 hours." Keith's face went red. "That's not accurate. My son was practicing his numbers. He wrote down random times." Heather asked to see the chart. I took her to the kitchen. She photographed it from multiple angles. The dates, the times in Keith's handwriting, the pattern of increasing duration. She asked Keith to explain the note about my mother not deserving her coat. Keith stammered. She kept trying to leave. I was trying to show her that going outside wasn't fun. It was cold, so she'd learn faster. Heather's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Officer Walsh asked if he could take photos of the house. Keith said yes quickly, like he had nothing to hide. The officer photographed everything. The chart, the guest room where my mother had been staying, the front door where she'd stood, Keith's office. He asked to see my phone, and I showed him the photos I'd taken last night. My mother's condition before I cleaned her up, the bruises, the matted hair. He took pictures of my pictures. Then he turned to Keith. "Mr. Sullivan, elder abuse is a criminal matter in our state. Based on the evidence we've documented today, there are grounds for charges. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Keith's face went pale. "Criminal charges? For what? For taking care of a difficult woman with dementia?" Officer Walsh listed them. Neglect, physical abuse, endangerment. Keith started talking fast. "This is insane. I never hurt her. She bruises easily from her medication. She falls all the time." The officer turned to me. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges against your husband?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." Keith stood up. "Lisa, don't do this. You're going to regret this." Officer Walsh held up his hand. "Mr. Sullivan, I need you to remain calm." Keith sat back down, but his jaw was clenched. His hands were fists. The officer asked Heather if she had what she needed. She nodded. Then he asked if I felt safe with Keith in the house. I said I didn't know. He said he couldn't remove Keith without an arrest or restraining order, but he could stay while Keith packed some things if I wanted him to leave. I looked at Keith, at his angry face, at the way he was staring at me like I'd betrayed him. I said yes. I want him to leave. Heather pulled me aside while Officer Walsh supervised Keith packing. She spoke quietly. "I'm opening an emergency investigation. Based on what I've seen today, this is a serious case. Your mother cannot be left alone with your husband under any circumstances. Do you understand? I nodded. Heather continued. I'm going to recommend you find alternative care for your mother immediately. She needs to be in a safe environment with proper supervision. I can give you resources for dementia care facilities in the area. She handed me a folder full of papers. Contact information for facilities, support services, legal resources. She said someone from APS would follow up within 48 hours, that they'd need to interview me again. Interview Keith separately. Possibly interview Oliver, though they'd try to avoid that if possible. She said the investigation could take weeks, that there would be court proceedings if charges were filed, that I needed to document everything, keep records, take photos, save any evidence. I listened and tried to absorb it all. My brain felt foggy from no sleep. Heather put her hand on my arm. You did the right thing calling us. Your mother was in danger. You protected her. I wanted to believe that. But I kept thinking about all the days I hadn't protected her. All the mornings I'd left her alone with him. Keith came downstairs with a bag. His face was red and his eyes were hard. Officer Walsh walked him to the door. Keith stopped and looked at me. You're destroying our family over nothing. Your mother is manipulative. She played you, and you fell for it. Now you're going to struggle alone. Good luck managing her care and paying for expensive facilities we can't afford. The officer opened the door. Mr. Sullivan, it's time to go. Keith left. The door closed behind him. Officer Walsh gave me his card. Call if you need anything or if he comes back. The restraining order process can take a few days, but document any contact he tries to make. Then he left too. Heather stayed a few more minutes. She went over the paperwork with me, explained the investigation timeline, told me to call her directly if I had questions or concerns. Then she left and I was alone in the quiet house with my mother. I called the hospital, asked to speak to my supervisor, explained that I had a family emergency and needed to take emergency leave. My supervisor knew my mother had Alzheimer's. She said take whatever time I needed, that they'd cover my shifts, that I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder Heather had given me. Information about memory care facilities, costs that made my stomach drop, resources for family caregivers, legal aid services. It was overwhelming. My phone rang. Moira. I answered and she asked how things were going. If Oliver could stay another day. I said yes, please. That things were complicated. That I needed time to figure everything out. Moira said Oliver was fine, happy, playing with her kids, that I should take all the time I needed, that she was here if I needed anything. Her kindness made my throat tight. After we hung up, I started researching facilities online, reading reviews, comparing costs, trying to figure out what I could actually afford on my salary alone. Keith's income had covered half our expenses. Without it, I'd be stretched thin, very thin. But I'd make it work. I had to. The phone rang again in the afternoon. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice, crying. Lisa? It's Barbara, Keith's mother. Please don't hang up. I need to talk to you. I waited. Barbara sobbed. Keith called me. He told me what happened. Lisa, please. You have to drop the charges. He's my son. He's a good man. He just got overwhelmed. Your mother is difficult. You know she is. Keith was trying his best. I felt anger rise in my chest. Barbara, good men don't lock helpless old women outside in freezing weather. Good men don't leave them standing there for hours without coats. Good men don't grab them hard enough to leave bruises. She kept crying. He made a mistake. He's sorry. If you press charges, it will ruin his life. He could go to jail, lose his job. You're destroying him over nothing. I said nothing wasn't the right word. That Keith had systematically abused a vulnerable person who couldn't defend herself. That he'd done it while I was at work trusting him. That our son had watched and learned to call it a game. Barbara started making excuses. Her voice got defensive. You don't understand the pressure he was under. Working from home, watching your mother all day. She wanders, she's confused, she needs constant supervision. It's exhausting. I hung up. My hands were shaking. The phone rang again immediately. Barbara. I declined the call. She called twice more. I blocked the number. My phone rang again an hour later. Different number. I answered carefully. This is Lisa. A woman's voice. Professional and warm. Hi, Lisa. This is Heather Robinson calling back. I have some information that might help you. I have a colleague I want to connect you with. My husband, actually. His name is Jeffrey Robinson, and he's an elder law attorney. He handles cases like yours, abuse situations. He can advise you on your legal options. Would you be interested in speaking with him? I said yes. Heather gave me Jeffrey's number, said he was expecting my call. that he'd worked with APS cases before and understood the system, that he could help me figure out next steps. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Jeffrey immediately. He answered on the second ring. His voice was calm and steady. He said he'd already spoken with Heather, that he understood the basics of my situation, that he had time tomorrow morning if I wanted to come in for a consultation. 9 o'clock. I said yes. He gave me his office address, said to bring all my documentation, the photos, the APS report number, any other evidence I had. I spent the rest of the evening organizing everything, creating a folder on my phone with all the photos, writing down a timeline of events, printing out the pictures I'd taken of the chart and my mother's condition, making notes about what Oliver had told me, what Keith had said, what I'd observed. By the time I finished, it was dark outside. My mother was sleeping in the guest room. The house was quiet without Keith, without Oliver, just me and my mother and the weight of everything that had happened. The next morning, I drove to Jeffrey's office. It was in a small professional building downtown. The waiting room was plain but clean. Jeffrey came out to meet me himself. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and kind eyes like Heather's. We went to his office and he had me sit down. Then he asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. I went through it all again. He took notes and asked questions. When I finished, he sat back in his chair. Lisa, I'm going to be direct with you. This is a serious case. What your husband did constitutes elder abuse under state law. The physical evidence is strong. The documentation is good. A PS is involved. The police are involved. You have multiple paths forward, but you need to act quickly. He pulled out a legal pad and started writing. First, you need to file for emergency custody of your mother. Right now, you and Keith presumably share guardianship. We need to get that changed immediately so he has no legal rights over her care. Second, you need a restraining order. Not just for your mother, but for you and your son. Keith's behavior suggests he could escalate. Third, you need to seriously consider divorce. This level of abuse indicates deep problems in your marriage, problems that won't get better. He looked at me directly. I know this is overwhelming, but you need legal protection for your family, all of you, not just your mother. I felt the weight of it settling on my shoulders. Emergency custody, restraining order, divorce, my marriage ending, my family broken apart. But Jeffrey's clarity helped somehow. He wasn't emotional about it. He was practical. These were steps, actions I could take, things I could control. I asked him what came next. He said he'd start the paperwork today, that we'd file for emergency custody and the restraining order by the end of the week. That everything would take time, but we'd get through it piece by piece. I left his office with another folder of papers and a plan. It wasn't much, but it was something. I filed for the restraining order that afternoon. Jeffrey drove me to the courthouse and walked me through the metal detectors. We sat in a waiting area with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. Other people filled out forms on clipboards. A woman with a black eye sat 3 seats away. Jeffrey reviewed my documents one more time. The photos were organized chronologically. The chart showing escalating abuse times. Pictures of my mother's bruises. Screenshots of the APS report. When our number got called, we went to a small office where a court clerk processed the paperwork. She asked me to verify my identity and relationship to my mother. I signed forms giving me temporary emergency custody. Then we went to a different floor for the restraining order hearing. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain. She reviewed everything Jeffrey submitted. The photos made her frown. She read through the APS report carefully. Then she asked me direct questions about the abuse. How long had it been happening? What specific acts had occurred? Whether my mother was in immediate danger? I answered each question as clearly as I could. My voice shook, but I got through it. The judge granted a temporary restraining order on the spot. Keith was prohibited from any contact with my mother. He had to move out of our house immediately. A police officer would supervise his removal that evening. The order was effective for 30 days with a full hearing scheduled for next month. Jeffrey thanked the judge and we left. I felt numb walking back to the car. It had taken less than 2 hours to legally remove my husband from our home. Keith called me 6 times before I got home. I didn't answer. Jeffrey told me not to engage directly. Let the police handle the move out. When I pulled into the driveway, a patrol car was already there waiting. The same officer who had taken my initial report. He asked to see the restraining order and I showed him the papers. Then we went inside together. Keith was in the living room pacing. He started yelling the moment he saw me. This is insane. You're destroying our family over nothing. The officer stepped between us and told Keith to calm down, explained that he had 2 hours to pack essential belongings and leave the premises. Keith's face went purple. 2 hours? Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem. the officer said. You need to start packing. Keith looked at me like I'd stabbed him. You're really doing this. Over your manipulative mother who doesn't even know what day it is. I didn't respond. The officer told him again to start packing. Keith went upstairs and I could hear him slamming drawers and cursing. The officer stayed in the living room with me and my mother. She sat in her chair watching everything with confused eyes. I held her hand. Keith came down twice with suitcases and boxes. Each time he tried to argue with me, tried to convince me I was making a huge mistake. Said I'd never manage without his income. That I was being emotional and irrational. That I'd come crawling back within a week. The officer finally told him to stop talking to me or he'd arrest him for violating the restraining order. Keith loaded his car in silence after that. When he finished, he stood in the doorway one last time. You're going to regret this, Lisa. I promise you that. Then he left. The officer waited until Keith drove away before leaving himself. He gave me his card and told me to call immediately if Keith tried to contact me or come back. After he left, the house felt strange and empty. My mother looked around like she was trying to figure out what had changed. I made her dinner and helped her eat. Then I called Moira and told her Keith was gone. She said Oliver was doing fine and asked if I wanted her to keep him one more night. I said yes. I wasn't ready to explain everything to my son yet. Oliver came home the next afternoon. Moira dropped him off with his backpack and gave me a long hug. Oliver ran inside calling for Keith. Where's Daddy? I sat down with him on the couch and took a deep breath. Daddy made some bad choices that hurt Grandma, so he has to live somewhere else for now. Oliver's face crumpled. What kind of bad choices? The waiting game, I said gently, putting Grandma outside in the cold. That wasn't a game, sweetheart. That was hurting her. Oliver started crying. Is it because I told you? I should have told you sooner. I pulled him into my lap and held him tight. No, baby. This is not your fault at all. You're a brave boy who helped me understand what was happening. You did exactly the right thing by telling me. But I could have told you the first time, Oliver sobbed. Then Grandma wouldn't have been outside so many times. I rocked him while he cried. Adults are responsible for their own choices. Daddy chose to do something wrong. That's on him, not on you. Your job is just to be a kid. Not to protect Grandma from Daddy. That's my job and I should have seen it sooner. We sat like that for a long time. Oliver asked if Keith was coming back. I said I didn't know yet, but right now he couldn't come here because of the court order. Oliver asked if he could still see his father. I said yes, we'd figure that out, but Daddy wouldn't live here anymore. Oliver seemed to accept this easier than I expected. He went to check on my mother and held her hand. I'm sorry Daddy was mean to you, Grandma. She patted his head but didn't seem to understand what he meant. Jeffrey had recommended a child therapist named April Pierce who worked with kids who witnessed abuse. I called her that evening and she had an opening the next day. Oliver and I went together. April's office had toys and books and comfortable chairs. She talked to Oliver alone for the first session while I waited outside. When they finished, April said Oliver was processing things pretty well, but would benefit from regular sessions. She recommended twice a week for the first month. I agreed immediately. Oliver seemed to like April. He said she had a fish tank and let him draw pictures. Over the next few weeks, those therapy sessions became part of our routine, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Oliver would talk to April about his feelings while I sat in the waiting room answering work emails. April said he was working through guilt about not telling me sooner. Learning that adults are responsible for their own actions. Understanding that what Keith did was wrong, even though Keith had called it a game. The sessions seemed to help. Oliver had fewer nightmares, started smiling more, asked fewer worried questions about whether things were his fault. I took my mother to the hospital where I work for a full medical evaluation. The doctor was someone I'd worked with for years. She examined my mother thoroughly, checked her vital signs and ran blood tests, asked questions my mother couldn't answer. The results were worse than I expected. My mother was dehydrated and malnourished. Her blood pressure was too high. She'd lost 12 pounds since her last checkup 3 months ago. The cognitive testing showed her Alzheimer's symptoms were more advanced than they should be for her disease stage. The doctor said stress and trauma could accelerate cognitive decline in dementia patients. My mother's confusion and anxiety were likely worse because of what Keith had done to her. I felt sick hearing this. The abuse hadn't just hurt her in the moment. It had made her disease progress faster. The doctor recommended immediate placement in a memory care facility. My mother needed professional care and monitoring. She needed proper nutrition and medication management. She needed to be somewhere safe where she could start recovering from the trauma. I called Heather from APS and asked for recommendations. She gave me 3 facilities that specialized in Alzheimer's care. I visited all of them that week. The first two felt institutional and cold. The third one was called Meadowbrook Memory Care. It had warm lighting and comfortable furniture. The staff seemed genuinely kind. They had experience with dementia patients and understood behavioral issues. The director showed me around. Private rooms with personal bathrooms. A secure courtyard where residents could walk safely. Activities designed for different cognitive levels. 24-hour nursing care. It was expensive, more than I could easily afford on my single income. But they accepted my mother's Medicare and I could cover the rest with her Social Security and some of my own money. I filled out the admission paperwork that afternoon. My mother could move in within 3 days. I went home and started packing her things. Comfortable clothes and family photos. Her favorite blanket. A stuffed bear she'd had since childhood. Oliver helped me choose which pictures to bring. He picked one of my mother holding him as a baby. We hung it in her new room the day she moved in. Keith's lawyer called Jeffrey 2 days after my mother was settled at Meadowbrook. The lawyer wanted to negotiate. Keith would accept the restraining order and stay away from my mother if I agreed to drop the criminal charges. Jeffrey called me to discuss. What do you want to do? I didn't hesitate. Absolutely not. Keith needs to face real consequences for what he did. He abused a helpless woman with dementia for weeks. He made my son witness it and think it was normal. He deserves to be prosecuted. Jeffrey said that was his recommendation too. He told Keith's lawyer there would be no deal. The criminal case would proceed. Keith's lawyer tried to argue that Keith had no prior record and had been overwhelmed by caregiver stress. Jeffrey shut that down fast. Caregiver stress doesn't excuse systematic abuse. The evidence was clear and documented. We weren't backing down. The police investigation continued over the next 2 weeks. The detective assigned to the case was thorough. He interviewed neighbors who confirmed seeing my mother standing outside in the cold. He reviewed my mother's medical records. He collected all the photos and documentation I'd provided. Then he discovered something I hadn't known about. Keith had been stealing from my mother's Social Security checks. Small amounts each month. $50 here, $100 there. He'd set up the direct deposit to go to an account he controlled. Then he'd transfer most of it to our joint account, but kept portions for himself. The detective found records going back 6 months. Keith had stolen almost $2,000 total. Financial exploitation of an elderly person. That charge got added to the elder abuse case. The prosecutor told Jeffrey this strengthened their case significantly. It showed a pattern of deliberate harm, not just neglect or poor judgment. I filed for divorce the same week the financial charges were added. Jeffrey handled the paperwork. I cited the abuse as grounds and requested full custody of Oliver. Keith got served at his mother's house where he was staying. He immediately contested everything. His lawyer filed a response demanding shared custody and claiming I was being vindictive. Jeffrey said this was expected. Keith would fight because he was angry and wanted to punish me. But the documented child endangerment made my case strong. Oliver had witnessed systematic elder abuse. Keith had involved him in recording the abuse on that chart. No judge would grant unsupervised custody under those circumstances. The divorce would take months to finalize, but Jeffrey was confident about the outcome. Keith could have supervised visitation, but Oliver would live with me full-time. Moira organized a meal train at the hospital. Different co-workers signed up to bring dinner 3 times a week. Casseroles and soups and pasta dishes that I could reheat easily. Other nurses covered my shifts when I had court dates or needed to take my mother to doctor appointments. Moira herself came over most weekends to help with laundry or cleaning or just to keep me company. The support kept me functional when I wanted to collapse from exhaustion. Between work and visiting my mother daily and taking Oliver to therapy and managing the legal proceedings, I barely had time to breathe. The guilt was constant and crushing. I should have seen the signs sooner. Should have checked on my mother during the day. Should have questioned why she seemed more confused and anxious. But Moira and the other nurses kept reminding me that I'd acted as soon as I knew, that I'd protected my mother and son the moment Oliver told me the truth, that beating myself up wouldn't help anyone. Their kindness got me through those first terrible weeks when everything felt overwhelming and impossible. Oliver started having nightmares 3 nights after Keith moved out. I'd hear him crying around 2 in the morning and find him sitting up in bed, shaking and calling for me. The dreams were always the same. Grandma standing outside in the cold, her knocking on the door, him wanting to let her in but Daddy saying no. Sometimes in the dreams she'd fall down and he couldn't reach her. Sometimes she'd disappear and he'd search the yard but couldn't find her anywhere. April said this was normal. Trauma processing through sleep. His brain trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed for weeks without understanding it was wrong. She worked with him twice a week now, using play therapy and art to help him express what he couldn't say in words. One session she had him draw the waiting game. He drew the front door with stick figure grandma outside and stick figure daddy inside with big headphones. The grandma figure had tears. April explained to him that adults make choices and face results for those choices. That his job was to be a kid, not to protect Grandma from his father. That telling me the truth was brave and right, but what happened after wasn't his responsibility to fix. He seemed to understand, but the nightmares continued. I'd sit with him until he fell back asleep, sometimes staying in his room the whole night on the floor beside his bed. Moira brought over a nightlight that projected stars on the ceiling. That helped a little. Oliver said the stars made him feel less alone when he woke up scared. My mother had been at the care facility for 2 weeks when I noticed small changes. She looked cleaner. Her hair was brushed and cut into a manageable style. Her clothes matched and fit properly. The staff kept her on a schedule. Meals at the same time daily. Activities planned throughout the day. Medication given correctly and on time. The doctor there adjusted her prescriptions after reviewing her records and noting she'd been over-medicated on some things and under-medicated on others. The confusion that had seemed so deep started to lift slightly. Not gone. The Alzheimer's was still there, still progressing. But the panic in her eyes faded. She seemed less scared. One afternoon I visited and she looked at me and said my name, Lisa. Just that, but clear and certain. I started crying right there in the activity room while she patted my hand like she used to when I was small. The next visit she didn't know who I was. Called me by her sister's name. But 2 days later she recognized me again. The facility director explained this was common. Good days and bad days. The disease would keep advancing, but removing her from the stress and abuse of Keith's care had given her some capacity back. She'd been so anxious and traumatized that her symptoms had appeared worse than her actual disease stage. Now, with proper care and safety, her real baseline was showing. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a cure. But it was something. Jeffrey called me at work during my lunch break. Keith's lawyer had contacted him with news. The prosecutor had offered Keith a plea deal. If he pleaded guilty to elder abuse and financial exploitation, they'd recommend probation instead of jail time. Mandatory counseling. Restitution for the money he'd stolen from my mother's Social Security. A guilty plea on his record. Keith's lawyer was strongly advising him to take it. Going to trial meant risking actual prison time if convicted, and the evidence against him was substantial. The chart documenting the abuse. Oliver's testimony. The medical records showing my mother's condition. The financial records proving theft. A jury would likely convict. Jeffrey asked what I wanted to do. I didn't need time to think about it. I wanted Keith to have a record. I wanted him to admit what he'd done. I wanted him to pay back every dollar he'd stolen. If he took the deal, he'd have to plead guilty in open court. It would be on his record permanently. He'd be a convicted abuser. That mattered to me more than seeing him in jail. Prison wouldn't undo what he'd done to my mother. But a conviction meant he could never pretend it didn't happen. Could never claim he was just a stressed caregiver who made mistakes. The legal system would officially label him an abuser. I told Jeffrey to tell the prosecutor we supported the plea deal. Keith accepted it 2 days later. The court date was set for 3 weeks out. The divorce proceedings started the same week Keith accepted the plea deal. Jeffrey filed the paperwork citing the abuse as grounds and requesting full custody of Oliver. Keith's lawyer filed a response contesting everything. Keith wanted shared custody, wanted to split assets 50-50, wanted to avoid paying child support. His lawyer argued that Keith had no prior criminal record before this incident and deserved consideration as a father. Jeffrey shut that argument down fast. Keith had involved Oliver in documenting abuse, had made our son witness systematic cruelty against a helpless woman, had taught Oliver that hurting vulnerable people were normal. No judge would grant unsupervised custody under those circumstances. The restraining order was still active. The criminal conviction would be on record soon. Keith's parental rights would be restricted to supervised visitation only. But Keith fought anyway. Not because he actually wanted custody. Jeffrey said this was common. The abuser fighting every detail out of spite, wanting to punish me for leaving, wanting to make the process as difficult and expensive as possible. Every asset got contested. The house, the cars, the furniture. Keith's lawyer filed motion after motion, dragging out the process. My lawyer bills climbed higher each week. Jeffrey gave me a payment plan, but I was still struggling to cover everything. My salary, my mother's care facility costs, the legal fees, Oliver's therapy, basic living expenses. The financial stress was crushing, but I couldn't back down. Oliver needed to be safe. My mother needed to be protected. Getting away from Keith completely was worth any cost. 6 weeks after that horrible night when Oliver told me about the waiting game, I sat in family court watching the judge sign the final divorce decree. Full custody to me. Supervised visitation only for Keith. Child support payments set at $400 monthly. Keith had to contribute $200 monthly toward my mother's care costs, as restitution for the money he'd stolen. The judge made it clear that any violation of the custody terms would result in immediate consequences. Keith sat across the courtroom with his lawyer, not looking at me. His jaw was tight. His hands were fists. When the judge dismissed us, Keith walked out without a word. I stood there holding the signed papers, feeling lighter than I had in months. Oliver was safe. My mother was safe. We were free. Jeffrey shook my hand and reminded me to call if Keith violated any terms of the agreement. I drove straight to Moira's house where Oliver had been staying during the hearing. He ran to me when I walked in and I picked him up even though he was getting too big for that. We were going apartment hunting tomorrow, starting over, just the two of us. It felt terrifying and hopeful at the same time. I found a smaller apartment the following week. 2 bedrooms, ground floor, 10 minutes from the care facility where my mother lived, 20 minutes from Oliver's school. The rent was higher than I wanted to pay, but manageable with Keith's support payments and careful budgeting. No dining out, no extra spending, every dollar accounted for. But it was ours, clean and safe and away from the house where so much bad had happened. I signed the lease and put down the deposit. Move-in date was 2 weeks out. I started packing immediately, boxing up Oliver's toys and books, my clothes and kitchen supplies, leaving behind anything that reminded me of Keith. The furniture could stay. I'd buy cheap replacements from thrift stores. Starting fresh meant leaving the old life behind completely. Moira helped me pack on weekends. Other nurses from the hospital donated household items they didn't need anymore. Dishes and towels and a coffee maker. Small kindnesses that made the impossible feel possible. I labeled every box and stacked them in the garage, counting down days until we could leave this house for good. Oliver helped me unpack in our new apartment. He arranged his toys on the shelves in his room, hung up the star poster Moira had given him, put his clothes in the small dresser. The space was smaller than his old room, but he didn't seem to mind. He kept saying it felt cozy, safe. We ate pizza on the floor that first night because I hadn't bought a table yet. Oliver talked about his new room and asked if he could paint it blue. I said yes. We could do whatever he wanted, make it completely his. He seemed lighter somehow. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for months was gone. He laughed more easily, played without that watchful look he'd developed around Keith. April said this was progress, that removing him from the toxic environment would help his healing. But she warned me he'd need continued therapy. The trauma didn't disappear just because we'd moved. It would take time, possibly years. But we had time now. We had safety. That was what mattered. Oliver fell asleep in his new room that night without nightmares. I checked on him twice, watching him breathe peacefully under his star nightlight. We'd made it out. We were going to be okay. My mother had good days and bad days at the facility. I visited 4 times a week, sometimes bringing Oliver on weekends. On good days, she knew who I was. She'd smile when I walked in and ask about Oliver. We'd have simple conversations about the weather or the food or the other residents. She'd remember things from long ago, stories about my childhood, her own mother, places she'd lived. Those moments felt precious. Brief windows where I got my mom back, even if just partially. On bad days, she was confused and agitated, didn't recognize me, asked for people who'd been dead for years, got upset about things that didn't make sense. The staff handled those days with patience I admired. They'd redirect her attention, engage her in activities, keep her calm and safe. I learned to accept both kinds of days, to treasure the good ones without expecting them, to stay present during the bad ones without taking her confusion personally. The Alzheimer's was progressing. That was the reality. But at least now she was cared for properly, fed and clean and safe. Never left outside in the cold, never denied basic dignity. That was more than Keith had given her. That had to be enough. Keith completed his mandated counseling over the next 3 months. 12 sessions with an anger management specialist as required by his probation. He showed up for every appointment because missing one would violate his plea agreement. But Jeffrey heard from the prosecutor that Keith's counselor reported minimal engagement. Keith attended physically but refused to actually participate. Gave short answers. Showed no genuine remorse or insight. Completed the requirement without any real change. This didn't surprise me. Keith had never taken responsibility for anything in our marriage. Always had excuses. Always blamed someone else. The counseling was just another hoop to jump through. Another thing to endure until he could move on. He never called to apologize. Never sent a letter taking real responsibility. The only communication came through lawyers about visitation schedules and support payments. Even those were contentious. Keith was always late with payments. Always finding reasons why he couldn't make the supervised visits. I realized I'd never really known the man I'd married. Or maybe I'd known but ignored the signs. The way he'd talked about difficult people at his job. The way he'd dismissed my concerns about things. Small cruelties I'd overlooked because they weren't directed at me. Until they were. Until my mother was vulnerable and Oliver was watching. I was grateful we'd gotten out when we did. Grateful Oliver was young enough that therapy could help him heal. Grateful my mother was safe even if her mind was slipping away. We'd survived. That was what mattered. Heather from APS called me on a Tuesday afternoon 4 months after that first terrible night. She wanted to schedule a final home visit to close out the case. I met her at my new apartment. She looked around at the small but clean space, reviewed the documentation showing my mother's placement at the care facility, confirmed that Oliver was in therapy and doing well, that Keith had no unsupervised access to either of them, that all the safety measures were in place and working. She sat at my small kitchen table and told me the case was officially closed. My mother was in appropriate care and no longer at risk. Oliver was safe. The system had done what it was supposed to do. Then she said something that stuck with me. She told me I'd done everything right by believing Oliver and acting immediately. That most cases of elder abuse go unreported because family members don't want to believe it's happening, don't want to disrupt their lives, make excuses for the abuser. But I'd listened to my son, documented everything, called for help, protected my mother. She said I should be proud of that, but I didn't feel proud. I felt guilty. Guilty that it had gone on for weeks before Oliver told me. Guilty that I hadn't seen the signs, hadn't checked on my mother during the day, hadn't questioned why she seemed so anxious and withdrawn. Heather said that guilt was normal but misplaced, that Keith had deliberately hidden the abuse, that I'd acted as soon as I knew, that I couldn't change the past, but I'd secured the future. She closed her file and shook my hand, told me to call if I ever needed anything. Then she left and I sat at my kitchen table crying. Not sad tears exactly, relief maybe, or exhaustion, or the release of months of tension finally letting go. Oliver came home from the school an hour later and found me making dinner. He hugged me tight and asked if I was okay. I told him I was. We were both going to be okay. Oliver's first day of first grade arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August. I'd registered him at the elementary school 2 blocks from our new apartment, close enough that we could walk together on my days off. The school counselor had met with me before the year started to review the family situation. She'd read the documentation I provided about the abuse case and the divorce. She assured me Oliver's teacher would be informed and would watch for any signs of trouble. But when I walked Oliver to his classroom that first morning, he seemed excited instead of nervous. He found his desk and started unpacking his new school supplies like this was just another adventure. His teacher smiled at me and gave me a small nod that said she understood and would keep an eye on him. I left feeling cautiously hopeful that maybe Oliver really was going to be okay. 2 weeks into the school year, I got my first progress report call from his teacher. She said Oliver had made friends with 3 other boys in the class and seemed well-adjusted. He participated in lessons and played nicely at recess. No behavioral issues at all. She'd been watching carefully for signs of trauma or acting out, but Oliver seemed like a normal 6-year-old starting first grade. I thanked her and hung up feeling a weight lift that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. April had told me that kids are resilient, but I'd been afraid Oliver's therapy wouldn't be enough to undo what he'd witnessed. Seeing him thrive at his new school made me believe we really had escaped in time. The next month, I joined a support group for family members of dementia patients. Moira had found the group and suggested I try it. She said talking to other people dealing with the same struggles might help me feel less alone. The group met every Thursday evening at a community center near the hospital. I walked in the first night feeling awkward and unsure what to expect. 12 people sat in a circle of folding chairs. A facilitator named Karen introduced herself and asked everyone to share their current situation. I listened to stories about spouses with dementia, parents who no longer recognize their children, the guilt of placing loved ones in care facilities. When my turn came, I gave a brief overview of my mother's Alzheimer's and her current placement at the care facility. I didn't mention the abuse or Keith, just focused on managing her progressive decline. But as I listened to others share their experiences over the following weeks, I realized how many of their challenges I understood. The grief of watching someone disappear while they're still alive, the exhaustion of coordinating care, the financial strain of memory care costs, the guilt that comes with every decision. These people got it in a way my other friends couldn't. They didn't judge me for placing my mother in a facility, or tell me I should try harder to care for her at home. They understood that sometimes professional care is the only safe option. By October, 3 months after leaving Keith, I finally started sleeping through the night again. The first few weeks in the new apartment had been rough. I'd wake up multiple times checking on Oliver, convinced something was wrong. Or I'd lie awake worrying about my mother, wondering if the facility staff was really taking proper care of her. The constant low-grade anxiety had followed me everywhere, always watching for the next crisis, always ready to react to danger. But gradually the hypervigilance started to fade. I'd go whole days without that tight feeling in my chest. I'd tuck Oliver in at night and actually relax instead of staying alert for problems. The apartment started feeling like a safe place instead of just temporary shelter. One night, I realized I'd slept straight through until my alarm went off. No nightmares about my mother standing outside in the cold. No waking up in a panic thinking I heard Keith's voice. Just solid, restful sleep. I lay in bed for a few extra minutes feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Cautious peace, but peace nonetheless. My mother and son were both safe. That was enough. In early November, the care facility director called and asked me to come in for a meeting. She sat me down in her office and explained that my mother's Alzheimer's was progressing faster than they'd initially expected. She was having more frequent episodes of confusion and agitation. She'd started wandering at night, trying to find her way out of the building. The facility had a memory care wing designed for patients with more advanced dementia. Locked doors, specialized staff, activities tailored for severe cognitive decline. The director recommended we consider moving my mother there within the next few months. I sat in that office feeling my throat tighten. Memory care meant accepting that my mother was getting worse, that the woman who raised me was slipping further away, that eventually she might not know me at all. But I also felt grateful. Grateful that I could provide this level of care now. Grateful that Keith wasn't making these decisions or blocking me from getting my mother proper help. I told the director I'd think about it and schedule a tour of the memory care wing. Walking out to my car, I let myself cry for a few minutes before driving home. The next week, Oliver had his regular Thursday session with April. When I picked him up, April asked if she could talk to me for a few minutes. We sat in her office while Oliver played in the waiting room. April told me Oliver had said something during their session that she wanted to share. He'd told her he felt like he'd saved Grandma by telling me about the waiting game. That if he hadn't spoken up, Grandma might have died outside in the cold. April had worked with him to understand that while he did help by telling the truth, the adults were responsible for fixing the problem. That it wasn't his job to save anyone. That he was just a brave kid who did the right thing by being honest with his mom. I felt tears forming again. I told April I was proud of Oliver for being brave enough to tell me. That I'd told him the same thing many times, but hearing it from her probably meant more. April smiled and said Oliver was doing remarkably well considering everything he'd witnessed. The therapy was helping him process the trauma and understand healthy family dynamics. She wanted to continue seeing him weekly for now, but she was optimistic about his progress. Keith's supervised visitation schedule continued through the fall, but he only showed up about half the time. The court order required him to give 24 hours notice if he couldn't make a visit, and he usually did, but his excuses were always vague. Work obligations or feeling under the weather or car trouble. Oliver didn't seem bothered when Keith canceled. When visits did happen, Oliver would come home and report that Daddy mostly played on his phone the whole time. They'd go to a fast food restaurant or a park, and Keith would sit on a bench scrolling while Oliver played. The supervisor noted this in her reports, but since Keith wasn't being inappropriate or neglectful during the visits, there wasn't much anyone could do. I realized Oliver was adjusting to having a father who was physically present but emotionally absent. Keith had always been that way to some extent, focused on his own interests while I handled the actual parenting. But now Oliver was old enough to notice and didn't seem to mind. He had me and his new friends and his therapy sessions with April. He didn't need Keith to be more than an occasional presence who bought him chicken nuggets and ignored him. In December, I got a small raise at the hospital. Not much, just a cost of living adjustment and a merit increase, but enough to make a difference in my tight budget. I decided to use the extra money to increase my visits with my mother from 3 times a week to 4. The care facility was a 20-minute drive from our apartment, so the additional visit meant more time and gas money, but I wanted to see her more often. My mother didn't always remember the visits afterward. Sometimes I'd arrive and she'd greet me like she hadn't seen me in months, even though I'd been there the day before. Other times she'd look at me with confusion, not quite sure who I was, but sensing I was someone important. But in the moment, during the visits, she'd smile when I walked in. She'd hold my hand while we sat together. She'd listen to me talk about Oliver and work even if she didn't follow all the details. Those moments of connection were enough. I wasn't visiting for her to remember. I was visiting because she deserved to have someone who loved her sitting with her, even if she forgot about it an hour later. On the anniversary of that terrible night when Oliver told me about the waiting game, I took Oliver to visit Grandma on a Saturday afternoon. We'd been in our new apartment for a year now. The divorce was finalized, Keith had completed his probation requirements, and Oliver was thriving in first grade. My mother had moved to the memory care wing 2 months earlier, and seemed more settled there with the specialized care. Oliver and I walked into the memory care common room and found my mother sitting by a window. I told her Oliver was here to see her and she smiled, though I couldn't tell if she recognized him. Oliver sat next to her and started talking about his school day, about his friends and his teacher and the book they were reading in class. My mother didn't respond much, just nodded occasionally and patted his hand. But Oliver kept talking, showing her the kindness and patience his father never did. He didn't get frustrated when she didn't answer his questions. He didn't expect her to remember what he'd said 5 minutes earlier. He just sat with her and talked and held her hand, treating her with the gentle care she deserved. I watched them together and felt something settle in my chest. We'd built a new life that felt stable and safe. It wasn't the life I'd planned a year ago, but it was better than the one we'd escaped.